Prynhawn da, croeso I gyd Astudiaeth Lleol Amser Cinio. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Lunchtime Local Studies. This is the first one that we've done, so please excuse any technical problems. We are recording, and if you don't want to be on the recording, please turn off your video camera. If you can all remain on mute. And if you want to ask any questions, at the top of your screen there is a little speech bubble if you want to put any questions in there, and I will be monitoring that. And without further ado, I am going to hand over to Gwilym Games, who is our local studies and special collections librarian. And I'm going to turn off my camera.
Okay, hello everyone. You probably shouldn't be able to see me. I've got some awesome slides, which I'm going to illustrate our talk this lunchtime. Hopefully everything will go smoothly. If there's a sort of like, there's strange sounds of stormy weather, that isn't just the sea taking over, but that is in fact sort of like heavy rain, which we've been having in Swansea all morning. So no changes there really for Swansea. So Swansea's got an incredible sort of like a history of sort of like connections to the sea, going back to the very beginnings of the town and city. So I'm going to be telling you some of those stories and sharing some of the tales with you today. So here you can see the sort of like some of the earliest sort of like boats you would have seen out in Swansea Bay. Which you could now, if you know, when you're going down to Swansea Central Library, which I'm sure many of you do, you could be sort of like, in the past, you would have seen these types of these boats and ships sailing across those same waters. Sort of like, sadly, they wouldn't have been able to go to the library back in those days, but they said that they would, that sort of like that was to come. So, for example, one of the sort of like earliest you might have seen is this style of boat, which is a Romano-British boat. Then during the sort of like post-Roman period, you would have said there's sort of like the type of thing would often be seen would be sort of like skin boats, which are sort of like used by the Celts quite frequently. And supposedly these are the ones were used by the sort of like Welsh saints and Irish saints in their travels back and forth between Ireland and Wales in the post-Roman period. But of course, soon after that, another set of visitors came into the Bristol Channel, the sort of like Vikings, who, you know, who sort of like many people think may have indeed founded Swansea. So one of the original names for Swansea is Swansea. Swansea, as it's been interpreted, suggesting it might have been founded by a Viking by the name of Sven. There's a lot of uncertainty about this, but it is certainly an interesting story. But the sort of like going beyond that into more recorded history, when the sort of like Normans conquered the area, the sort of like they were already sort of like using the sea as a vital means of transportation, and Swansea was already there was already a port connection there of some kind, which was gradually to expand when it became a Norman borough and build it up. If we sort of like, though there's stuff you could say about the medieval period, we'll skip over that and talk about a sort of like there's sort of like a period going into Tudor times. And sort of like I did promise some mysterious pirates in this talk, and this is what our first pirate or / privateer, as they more correctly termed, who was also a great Swansea dignitary, none other than Sir Matthew Craddock, who sort of like seems to have given his name to Craddock Street in Swansea today, and is one of the sort of like greatest sort of like most important figures of Tudor Swansea, and a very important figure in South Wales as well. Matthew Craddock was of sort of Welsh noble descent, with a sort of like a long, elaborate Welsh genealogy, sort of like and he wielded tremendous power. There was a sort of basically he was close connected to the Earl of Worcester, the Lord of Gower, and one of the most powerful noblemen in South Wales, the sort of like and seemed to have acted as a deputy and a steward of Gower and Cilfey. He was a sort of like he was appointed constables of various castles, including Caerphilly, and was also was a key figure in raising troops locally for Henry VII in some of his wars. But there's a sort of like a lot of Tudor noblemen, there was a sort of like Craddock was, had some dodgy characteristics. One of the earliest sort of like mentions of Craddock is in June 1483, when he's described as Swansea and captain of a ship of war the Ram, but he was accused of piracy, despite being an official, and arrested, was brought before the King and Council. We don't know exactly what happened, but we do know that this was brought out. And he was there was a complaint from Henry Matthew, and Nicholas Fleming of Brittany, of the their ship, which was taking goods from Bridgewater to Portugal, and the ship, the Matthew Craddock, Matthew himself named his ship after himself, had entered and ran before the ship could move on to Lisbon, had basically demanded a ransom of £50, and £50 in those days was a huge sum of money. For the otherwise presumably there were all sorts of threats laid against them. As I said, we don't know exactly what the result of this court case is, but we know that Craddock was using his warship and his authority to impose drama. Craddock's wealth and power, which he gained throughout his life, but to various dodgy proceeds, eventually led him to establish Plas House, expand Plas House. Plas House was already existing, which is a nobleman's house in the midst of the Castle Bailey. It's basically where Castle Gardens is now. These are the ruins of what the remnants of the house were in 1835. So some the house is now long gone, obviously, but we can see how wealthy he would have been. Talking a bit about Craddock's ship, the Matthew Craddock. You can see here a contemporary print of Henry VIII at Dover, going across to meet up with the King of France for the famous Cloth of Gold encounter in 1520. You can see here a great number of contemporary Tudor ships. One of these, I'm not sure which one, is going to be the Mary Rose. As some of you might have seen, remnants of the Mary Rose came into Swansea recently and were on exhibit in the Glenvivian. But amongst the British fleet at the time were a number of ships from Swansea, and they had fought for Henry VIII in various battles. But you can see the style of ships, you can see, which were known as carracks at the time, and they were particularly large. There's a this scene of 19th century Swansea shows roughly what Swansea would have looked like in terms of its river. And you can see here how ships in this this period before the docks were properly established were beached on the side. And this is a lot of the time the way that ships would have been in Tudor Swansea would have been brought in and brought up, when the smaller ones would have been brought ashore, and it gives you a good idea of the general layout of Swansea at the time. The Matthew was very, very successful. He got married twice. First, the Mansell family of Oxford's Castle, and his second marriage was even more prestigious. Catherine Gordon, who was Lady Catherine Gordon, who was the widow of Perkin Warbeck, one of the pretenders to the throne of Henry VII, who had been defeated and kept in prison, but eventually was executed by Henry VII, and then later ended in Bedford Craddock. Catherine Gordon's children later on became the Earls of Pembroke, an even more important family. So if we return to his sort of Matthew Craddock's seaworthy exploits, there's sort of like back in sort of like April 1512, war broke out with France, and the sort of like commander for the English forces, English and Welsh forces, was Admiral Sir Edward Howard. He used Mary Rose, the famous Mary Rose, the 600-ton warship, which had only just been built, coming to service a year earlier, as his flagship. The sort of like in those particular wars, Matthew Craddock had his own ship out there, the 240-ton ship, the sort of like which is called the Matthew Craddock, and which had 100 sailors and 100 soldiers on board. The captain of that vessel was paid the princely sum of 18 pence, and so there were various exploits of Matthew Craddock and his men during the sort of like war, including inevitably on 10th of June 1512, Matthew Craddock and his men captured and robbed Nicholas Le Cenzi and his partners of Rouen of goods valued at 44,000 francs, which was a huge sum at that stage. So, as in traditional Matthew Craddock style, he was using the opportunity of warfare to enrich himself. During the warfare, sort of like Admiral Howard specifically mentions the Matthew Craddock as a ship involved as a set of reinforcements coming from Bristol. This sort of like particular war with France was a sort of like saw a number of British victories, but the sort of like Matthew Howard himself died soon afterwards, boarding a French galley. He was sort of like took up a number of smaller boats to try and board, and leading the attack head on and urging his men forward. He unfortunately got isolated and sort of like was sort of like it's according to one story, he was pushed overboard, wearing his armor. He didn't stand a chance, and he sank to the bottom and died. But nevertheless, that particular conflict, which ended in sort of like indeterminately, really. But the sort of like would sort of like obviously raise Matthew Craddock's profile. So by 1517, he was knighted, and this was probably down to the influence of his patron, the Earl of Worcester. And he was and this seems to be around the time of his marriage to Lady Catherine Gordon, as we mentioned earlier. So like the Craddock had a whole bunch of ships, which was part of a small fleet, including the Anthony Craddock and the Mary Craddock. So it's sort of like he's a sort of like fascinating character who took like a lot of sort of Tudor noblemen, sort of like had a sort of like a rather hazy notion of the law, at least regarding him. Craddock and his Craddock was buried in this incredibly ornate tomb, which used to be in St. Mary's. Sadly, it is lost. It was sort of like this is a picture showing the damage to the tomb, sort of like after World War II, during the bombing when St. Mary's was destroyed, and the damage is so severe they couldn't preserve the tomb, and I'm afraid it's gone. But sort of like but he's sort of like he's presumably his bones may still are still within. Though the tomb is gone, I presume that the bones are still somewhere within St. Mary's. So sort of like a famous sort of like pirate and a noble captain is located in there. We can see here, this is Sir Francis Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, another Tudor carrack. And you can see the sort of like this is 150 tons, so it's a bit smaller than the Matthew Craddock 200, which was 260. But you can see the style of ship we're talking about. So if we go on from there and talk a bit more about some other sort of like interesting stories, sea stories. Now you can see here, this is is none other than the Helvetia, the sort of wreckage of the Helvetia, which anyone who's gone down to the Scilly, depending on how high the tide is, you will see bits of the wreck. Certain points you can see more of the ribs, and that's a Norwegian Park 1887, which was wrecked. But sort of like the though the story of Amati is interesting, I don't have time to talk about that. So we're going to talk about one of the more famous sort of like local wrecks on the Vasily, which was the sort of mysterious dollar ship, a legendary treasure ship, long lost, which sort of like, but which its treasure was found hundreds of years later, sort of, and brought great wealth to the people, to the local people. Basically, what seems to have happened in 1807, sort of like a large storm, sort of like blew up, and sort of like soon after the storm was over, sort of like things have been blown up onto the beach. But and sort of like obviously this is not a known, you know, on the beach of things, but what these were silver coins, silver dollars, sort of like of a style which you would see. Oops, there's another picture of the City Bay. You can see the full glory of it there. But this is the type of thing you would have seen, which were tossed up on the City Bay, the silver reals, or silver dollars as they were known, and these were sort of like a vast quantities of them had been thrown up on the beach. And the local people went crazy and started charged down to recover them. Now, this had happened before. That local stories had said sort of like silver dollars had turned up on the beach at other previous points. And there was a sort of like all the ones which were recovered in 1807. They tended to be from dated from 1625. You can see here this one is from 1628, and there's a sort of like they were either between 1625 and 1639. Also, an iron cannon was washed up on shore as well. And this has all happened on March the 7th, 1807. The Cambrian newspaper, which reported on this in detail, remember you can find out about the Cambrian by sort of like checking on the amazing Cambrian index online, which is available on the Swansea Library's website. It's got all sorts of exciting things and may indeed, if you check it, lead you directly to treasure, whether it's actually silver treasure or just exciting historical treasure, who knows. But there's a sort of like as I said, the story in there suggested that the finds were all part of a rich Spanish vessel on the way back from the South America called the Scandinavian galley. One of three richly laden ships carrying the door of dowry of a Spanish princess to marry an English nobleman. Now, unfortunately, when people have investigated this story later on, no one can quite work out what ship they're talking about. Sort of like, so it's again one of those situations where myths and legend may build up. What we do know is the silver dollars are real, but we don't really know where they come from. It has been suggested that this particular ship was connected to the marriage of Catherine Braganza from Portugal to King Charles II in 1661. But as you can see from the dates of the coins, the dates don't, you know, why would it just be from that period? You know, the dates don't entirely match with that. There's a sort of like a bit of a mystery regarding it, and no one is. The truth is no one is quite sure what ship these silver dollars have come from. We're also not sure whether any more are going to be found. More dollars were found washed up in 1833, so it could be the wreck is still out there, possibly long disintegrated, but maybe there's chests still waiting off the Vasily coast, ready to throw more silver dollars up on the sea. There's sort of like particular story has another element to it. Another local legend connected to the dollar ship is the Spectre Chariot of Vasily. Supposedly the sort of like a local sort of like a nobleman, the sort of like Edward Mansell Edward Mansell of Llandewey was living locally, and supposedly when sort of like at an earlier period in when the ship was first wrecked in the 17th century, he heard about the sort of like wreck of the ship, and he dashed down on his sort of like in his coach and horses to the Vasily beach to get to the wreck before anyone else. Whether this is a sort of like and supposedly on dark and stormy nights, if you go down to the Scilly, you will still see the Spectre chariot dashing across the Sounds as the gallops of the sort of like Edward Mansell, desperate to get to the silver dollars before anyone else. Certainly, one of the interesting things is that Mansell supposedly did leave the local area and did leave the UK and died in some mysterious circumstances. So whether this is a sort of like what truth there is to this legend, I do not know. Certainly, I wouldn't like to be on the Scilly on a dark and stormy night, though. Whether again this is also tied in with the wreckers of the Scilly. Supposedly, more than one ship was possibly lured ashore by sort of like by wreckers from local villages who put out false lights. How much truth there is in these stories again is difficult to say. But certainly one thing is certain, that if a ship was wrecked, the local people were always there ready to step up. So if we head over to the sort of like final, with some of the final things I'm going to be talking about. Now you can see here, one of the things famously connected with pirates is parrots. Most famously because of Long John Silver, who had his own sort of like own parrot, who famously recited pieces of 8, once again referring to Spanish gold and silver. But actual pirates did have parrots as well, and there was one sort of like connected to sort of like Swansea, and this goes back once again to Tudor times. Sort of like John White of Neath was sort of like taking a shipment of coal across to France in 1580. He was a sort of like he was plundered and boarded by French pirates or privateers, and they sort of like I think John White was a sort of like complained that they sort of like told the Admiralty Court that that he was beaten by the French, and they laid the points of daggers and rapiers to his heart, his throat, and his eyes, and threatened that he would be stabbed, except he would confess where his money was, and he was constrained to deliver it for safeguard of his life. He claimed, goods and money worth £140 at a value of £200. So like he continued on his trip to France, managed to, with what remnant of his cargo, and returned back. And then when he returned back to Swansea, he was sort of like he had some connections with sort of like a ship known as the Primrose of London. The sort of like Primrose sort of like had come into Swansea in 1581 after a voyage of a supposed voyage of Ireland, and there's a sort of like the end of 1581. The sort of like the Primrose of London appeared off Mumbles Roads, and this is sort of like but didn't actually go into harbour in Swansea or Neath. People were suspicious of this, and it was suggested locally that he might have been sort of involved in piracy. So local officials, so the local county piracy commissioners, who were Sir Edward Mansell of Margam, Sir Edward Stradling of St Donats, and William Matthew, were summoned, and the master of the ship, Philip Smythe of Bristol, and the purser and the gunner of the Primrose were examined. And the sort of like, but the local nobleman, after questioning these people, the captain and his men, decided, nope, these people are obviously not pirates. We're going to just let them go. But later on, they sort of like when the ship came into Swansea town, and they came with other and as contemporary report said, They, with other of their company, came daily to Swansea town, and there made merry in sundry places of the town, and behaved themselves very cleverly and honestly. Whether this is true, what exactly happened is not certain. The story told by the master of the vessel, he set out for Southampton to lay coal, to bring to France. On their way going down the Devonshire coast, they ran into a pirate vessel. The Captain Stephen Haynes in Tor Bay, and they bought from the pirate a quantity of goods: Brazil wood, cotton, Brazil pepper, and a collection of monkeys and parrots. These are ships. These stuff have apparently come from a French ship that had been traded in Brazil, and had been captured by Haynes. So there's a sort of so it's difficult to know what exactly happened, whether Primrose itself was a pirate, but it seems possible that Smith was telling the truth. So the foreign goods on the Primrose basically, he had acted as a fence for a pirate. So what the Piracy Commissioners should have done when they learned this is confiscate the goods, which had been obviously stolen. But that doesn't seem to be what happened. So rather than they came into Swansea, they started selling their stuff off, and they weren't even charged customs duty. But they sort of interestingly, some people did benefit from this. Sir Edward Mansell, one of the Piracy Commissioners, got a monkey. Sir William Herbert of Swansea, a descendant of Matthew Craddock, got another monkey, while the customer who they sold got 2 parrots. There's sort of and there was some debate about the nature of these parrots. When you had people to dinner and supper with them over Christmas, these were parrots apparently in station, but apparently they died within a fortnight. So there's a sort of all sorts of dodgy things going on. Certainly Haynes, a well-known West Country pirate, was well known for doing this type of thing. He gave a sort of he exchanged parrots for 3 hogsheads of beer. 2 parrots and a monkey were given to Lady Howard in a sort of in the West Country. Another way of keeping the local nobles happy. And even gave the Lord Admiral's cook 2 such birds. Haynes' other piracy involved stealing green cotton cloth, involved raiding 2 Scottish ships, which were carrying books to Scotland from London. And Haynes was well known for insisting that his men all wore green cotton clothing. So all this was came in, and there's into the inquiry when John White was come in, and whether there's John White, who had suffered from French pirates, was supposedly supplying coal to the Primrose. There was a there's all this the interconnections between a guy who had just been robbed by French privateers. He's now got involved in doing trading with English pirates and Welsh pirates in the part of this ongoing interconnections. So eventually the trade was they did pretty well, and they got White got 4 tons of Brazil wood for £26, and which they later was sold for £40. They made a big profit there, and amongst other odds and ends, including a broken anchor and cannon, which he managed to get hold of as well. Later on, White got involved in more drama in 1586, where on a trip to France, where he met some seemingly met some French people who then accused of being the pirates who had robbed him in 1580, and he seemed to have a history of this. Then one time in Swansea in 1591, John White met 2 Frenchmen in the street and said, "Oh, no, you robbed me 10 years ago," and had them arrested. But White didn't actually have any proof that they were actually the men who had robbed him. So it was just kind of they were taken to Cardiff on charges of piracy, and they seem to have gone off. So you can see pirates and parrots. There's another pirate monkey, presumably one of the one which was traded to the nobleman of Swansea to get them off. And to finish off, I just want to talk a little bit about the mysterious Joseph Avery, who was a sort of like a pirate, sort of like who came to a sorry end. He was captured and he was hanged. Sort of like in 1731. He was hanged off on Mumble's head, where the lighthouse was later going to be built. Hanged in irons. Now, his name, Joseph Avery, is quite interesting. As one of the most famous pirates of all time was Captain Avery, who had plundered a Mughal treasure ship full of gold and diamonds in 1711, making a huge, vast sum, probably a billionaire in modern terms, probably the richest pirate haul ever made. Avery completely disappeared. No one ever knew what happened to him, or indeed much of his treasure. Was Joseph Avery sort of like related to Henry Avery? Did he just drop that name to make himself sound cool? Was he part of Avery's pirate crew? Who knows? But what we do know is Joseph Avery is came to a horrible end. And what's interesting about this particular tale is you've got the bill for his execution. So you can see here, we've got the chains, list of the chains to hang up. The sort of like Joseph Avery taken all the way from Bristol to Oystermouth, and the various expenses to carry out the execution. The carpenter who made the gallows and timber, and they fixed the timber and the carpenter to make it. And what was sort of like another sort of element of that is there was a sort of a petition filed in Neath to the worships and justices of the peace for the court assessors of the county of Glamorgan, of Matthew Hall, carpenter of Oystermouth, and this petitioner, by order of Hugh Walter of Swansea, employed to build a gibbet for execution of the man condemned last sessions, was promised to be paid by Walter Hughes, told him the sheriff's appointment to be paid 16 shillings out of pocket. And the deputy sheriff promised to be paid, but he's not yet been satisfied. He's made 2 journeys after it, and hope his worships would take into consideration and bound your petitioner to pay up. And so the carpenter who built the gallows never got his. It seems to have had a sort of like drama trying to get hold of the money, and there's a sort of like we don't know if he ever did actually get hold of his cash in the end. And just to finish off with some tales of a few minor mentions of smugglers. There's so many smuggler stories down Gower, I can't really go into many of them. But since we were talking about Vasili, one of the most famous smugglers over that area was William Stoke, the innkeeper of Middleton, who was a sort of like notorious smuggler, and one of his exploits was sort of like he actually, when a customs officer sort of like tried to intercept some stuff from him, he sort of like intercepted the customs officer and basically locked him up in his stable till he had a chance to hide stuff away. There was a sort of like and so Stoke was one of the people on there. And there was also one of the most famous locations was on somewhere on Vasili Downs. Is supposedly pirate contraband was commonly concealed up on the downs, sort of like buried or hidden in caves, and sort of like the customs raids on the area were common. One occasion where customs got there in time, the smugglers had to run off. And they found 101 casks of brandy, rum, and wine, all left on Vasili Beach. So that was one of the more sort of like exciting exploits of rum, which people got hold of back in the day. So that is the end of my talk. If I could just find out the way I close this down, I have no idea.
Don't worry about that. Or just exit. Go back to stop sharing your screen in the top corner with the little arrow.
Oh, right, yep, okay.
So diolch Gwilym, that was fantastic. I have massive memories of being at Rosilly and looking out for that chariot. So that was lovely to hear. We do have a question for you.
Okay, here we go.
So is John White the artist and colonist?
John White, the artist and columnist, no, as far as I'm aware, it's the sort of like he was a merchant, a sort of like of sort of like said it was Tudor about 1580, 1581. I said, and as far as I know, he remained a merchant for the rest of his life. I don't think he was involved in colonies, as far as I know. But I think there is if I remember rightly, there is a Swansea artist, John White, from later on.
Fantastic. I think we've got another question coming through as well.
Oh, right.
Just hold on for one moment.
No problem.
Okay, so yes, is there any monument to Matthew Craddock in Swansea?
That's an interesting question, actually. I mean, I've got a feel, I must say, I can't swear to it, but I believe that there is commemoration to him inside St. Mary's. But sort of like, it's something I should know, but I can honestly say there was a sort of like, I don't believe there is. I mean, the main monument is, I believe that Craddock Street, which we'll know today, that is a sort of like, as far as my understanding is either named after Craddock directly or possibly one of his sort of like one of the other family members. But Sir Craddock is a very significant figure in Swansea history because he seems to have brought in quite a bit of trade and he was an incredibly important figure in South Wales as sort of like a deputy to the sort of Earl of Worcester, who was one of the most important noblemen. So he was a sort of like basic, Worcester himself preferred to didn't run his estates locally. So basically Craddock was the guy in charge of the sort of like all the estates of basically all the lordship of Gower, which obviously is a huge amount of land, but also the Earl of Worcester's estates extended right across South Wales, so he had a lot of influence everywhere. So a major figure, definitely.
So we will wrap it up there. If you do have any other questions, you can get in touch with Library Line via swansea.gov.uk/libraries, and there is a link there to Library Line. So diolch yn fawr iawn I bawb. So thank you very much to everyone. If you want to keep an eye out on when we're going to be having more of these, please keep an eye on our Facebook page.